What if the worst day of your life was the one that quietly saved your heart? The stagecoach rolled to a stop in the middle of nowhere, and Clara Jennings stepped down into a wind that cut straight through her Boston coat and every last bit of pride she'd carried this far. Silverton Crossing wasn't the bustling town Nathaniel Kerr had described in his letters. It was 2 leaning buildings, a tired depot, a muddy street, and not a single man in an Eastern suit waiting with flowers or a smile. The driver dropped her trunk with a thud and said what she already feared. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Her fingers tightened around Kerr's letter, those neat lines promising order, fairness, and a respectable arrangement for a woman everyone back home had quietly decided was a burden. Before panic could swallow her, hooves drummed over the hard dirt, and a lone rider appeared out of the fading light. Jonah Reed, tall, dust-worn, grey-eyed, tipped his hat and said he'd been asked to fetch her, that Kerr had business and no time to stand at a depot. Something in his voice told her he didn't much like repeating those words. Still, the sun was dropping. The land felt bigger than anything she'd ever seen, and there was nowhere to go back to. On Jonah's quiet promise that she'd be safe under his roof, Clara climbed onto his spare horse and rode away from the empty station, the stagecoach rattling off without so much as a backward glance. His ranch was nothing like the tidy photograph Kerr had sent. It was a small house, a weathered barn, a crooked windmill, and one old hound on the porch. But there was a fire burning inside, and a bed he gave up for her without hesitation, choosing to sleep in the barn rather than risk a single whisper about her reputation. That night, in a stranger's room with a stranger's blanket around her shoulders, Clara reread Kerr's cold, careful words and thought of Jonah's rough hands setting an extra place at his table without being asked. Somewhere between the wind at the depot and the man in the barn, a terrible question settled under her ribs. If a man truly wanted her, would he send someone else to meet her? And if he didn't, what had she really come all this way to belong to? That was when Clara realized the real danger might not be the wild land outside, but the truth about the man who never showed up and the quiet cowboy who did. 3 days turned into 3 long mirrors, each one reflecting the same ugly truth. The roads were clear, the sky was clear, and Nathaniel Kerr still did not come. Every morning Jonah saddled his bay and rode up to the rise to scan the horizon, and every afternoon he came back with dust on his coat and a simple, painful answer in his eyes. When Clara finally asked if the road was washed out, Jonah didn't hide behind excuses. He just said, "Roads are fine," and let the silence tell her the rest. The humiliation hit first. She'd crossed half a country for a man who couldn't be bothered to stand at a station. But beneath the sting was something she didn't expect. Relief at not stepping into a life Kerr had described like a contract, full of rules about obedience, modesty, and gratitude. When she tried to pack her trunk and insist on the boarding house in town, Jonah told her plainly that the only room available was above the saloon, with thin walls and a man who drank more than he prayed. Winter was coming down from the mountains. There were worse fates than pride. So he offered her something no man ever had, time and shelter with no price attached. "Stay," he said, "until you decide what you want to do. Work for your keep if it makes it easier." He didn't ask for promises. He just made coffee every morning and made sure there was wood stacked high enough to keep the stove burning through the night. Day by day, Clara learned the rhythm of the ranch, how to gather eggs without losing a finger, which horses liked apples and which liked space, how Jonah always checked the lantern by the door before dark, as if danger might come looking if you ever forgot. When the first real winter storm rolled in like a grey wall and the house shook under the weight of the wind, The two of them ended up on the floor near the stove, wrapped in separate quilts, sharing old stories to drown out the howl outside, her broken engagement and life as a walking shame in Boston, his brother who went to war to see the world and came back under a flag. By the time she woke with her head against Jonah's shoulder, his arm curved protectively around her, without him even realizing it, Clara understood two things she'd never dared admit before: that she was more at home in this rough little room than she'd ever been in any parlour back east, and that the man she'd never intended to meet was starting to feel far more dangerous to her heart than the one who'd left her standing in the dust. Because when the storm ended and the world outside finally thawed, they would have to decide whether this strange, fierce warmth between them was just a winter accident or the beginning of something neither of them had gone looking for. When the snow finally melted into mud and the sky softened back to blue, Clara told Jonah she needed to go into town, not to beg Nathaniel Kerr for anything, but to look him in the eye and close the door herself. He hitched the wagon in silence, jaw tight, and they rode into Silverton to find the street already buzzing. Word had travelled that the Boston bride was still on Jonah Reed's land, and the man who'd sent for her was not happy about it. Kerr stood outside his mercantile in a fine coat that didn't fit the dirt under his boots, softer and smaller than his letters had made him seem, with eyes that looked at Clara like she was an overdue invoice. He called her ungrateful, reminded her loudly that he'd paid her passage, and said she owed him a life because he'd bothered to send a ticket. The old Clara might have shrunk under the stairs, but the woman who'd survived a winter storm on Jonah's kitchen floor did not. She told him, clear enough for the whole street to hear, that he'd paid for a seat on a train, not for ownership of any part of her. If she owed him anything, it was coins, not vows. She tossed a small pouch at his feet, every scrap she'd saved from selling her mother's jewellery, and said that made them even. When he reached for her arm, Jonah stepped between them so fast the crowd gasped, hand hovering near his holster, voice quiet but edged with steel, as he told Kerr he was done talking to her like she was property and done laying hands on her at all. That might have been the end of it, but a circuit judge stepped forward with a stack of papers and a different story. Kerr had been writing letters like this all over the territory, dangling security in front of women with nowhere to go, then using their desperation to squeeze free labour and favours out of them. There were complaints, testimonies, and enough bad ink in those ledgers to put cracks in all the fancy talk about arrangements. In front of everyone, the judge said what Clara had needed to hear. She wasn't bound to Nathaniel Kerr by any law, promise, or scrap of paper. If she stayed with Jonah, it was because she chose to. If she left, it would be on her terms. As Kerr blustered and stomped off, clutching his little pouch of coins like it was the last scrap of power he had left, Clara felt the eyes of the town shift. She wasn't a problem to be shuffled anymore. She was a woman who had stood her ground. And as she climbed back into Jonah's wagon, shoulder-brushing his, she knew the story wasn't ending at that muddy crossroads. It was just changing shape, because men like Kerr didn't forgive being exposed, and the next storm he brought down on them wouldn't be made of snow. If you're feeling hooked by Clara and Jonah's fight to build their own life, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what Kerr does next on this ruthless frontier. Kerr didn't come back with guns blazing. He did what small men with money always do. He tried to make them disappear by inches. Credit Jonah had always had at the store dried up overnight. Feed orders arrived short. A coil of wire came miscounted, just enough to leave a fence half finished. One bitter morning, Jonah found the south fence cut and a dozen head wandering toward thin creek ice. They saved most of them, but one calf still went under. Clara watched him haul that stiff little body out of the water, every quiet line of his face set in a way that said, this hurt more than he'd ever admit. When she raged that Kerr was trying to starve them into defeat, Jonah didn't argue. He just said he'd fought worse enemies than a shopkeeper with a pen, and that he didn't intend to lose now. What neither of them expected was how the valley answered. Neighbours who'd been too scared to speak up began to show up at their gate instead. Emily and Luke with extra lumber and a rumour about a cheaper feed supplier 2 towns over. Mrs. Black with seeds and hard-earned advice. The saloon keeper with news from travellers that Kerr's bullying had gone too far for too long. Around that kitchen table, over coffee and worn maps, the fight stopped being just Jonah's burden and became a quiet rebellion. All the while, life at the ranch wrapped itself more firmly around Clara. She wasn't the woman waiting in a borrowed bed anymore. She was the one lighting lamps, organising the pantry, learning which cows pushed the fences and which kids from neighbouring ranches snuck scraps to the hound. One night, when Jonah came back late with his sleeve bloodied from a knife slash left by one of Kerr's hired men at the fence line, Clara's hands shook as she cleaned and wrapped the cut. He was more worried about the cost of new shirts than the wound, but when she told him she was done standing back while he took every blow alone, he finally let some of the weight slip from his shoulders. "You're already holding half of it," he said quietly. "I just haven't known how to say it without sounding like I'm asking for more than I got a right to." Between sabotage and long days, their connection kept deepening in the small, ordinary ways that matter more than any grand speech. Shared coffee at dawn, the way his hand found the small of her back when a wagon rattled too close in town, her laughter turning his silent house into something that sounded suspiciously like home. And while the judge gathered statements and ledgers in the background, building a case strong enough to finally crack Kerr's hold over the valley, Clara and Jonah were building something just as powerful out on that patch of land. A life that was beginning to look less like temporary shelter and more like the place their hearts had quietly chosen. Because when a man is willing to bleed for your safety and a woman is willing to face down her own shame in public for the truth, the only real question left is how long they can pretend this is anything less than love, and what will happen when the law and the land finally shift enough for them to say it out loud. In the end, Kerr didn't fall because of one brave speech or one bent fence post. He fell because too many people finally decided they were done being afraid of the wrong man. The day the marshal and sheriff rode into Silverton with a warrant and a stack of papers thicker than any of Kerr's boastful letters, the whole town watched him get led out of his own store in irons, spluttering about contracts no judge would honour any more. Clara stood in the crowd with Jonah's hand hovering just at the small of her back, not quite touching, but close enough to feel like a promise, and understood that she had arrived just late enough in his story to be the last mistake he ever made. What followed wasn't a fairy tale. It was real life, which is messier and better. Clara stayed at the ranch not as a guest, but as something far more dangerous and beautiful, a partner. She rose with Jonah, helped carve frightened heifers in spring mud, hosted neighbours around their long table until their house became the place where news and comfort both seemed to land first. When the circuit judge quietly asked if she was sure about tying herself to a man with more scars than savings, she smiled and said she'd had enough of men with polished shoes and empty hands. They married in the small church with wild flowers in jars and off-key fiddle music, surrounded by the same people who had watched them fight side by side. And for the first time in her life, Clara said, "I do," without feeling like she was signing anything away. Years passed, marked not by parties or seasons in Boston, but by calves and harvests. Storms survived, fences rebuilt, One soft morning, Clara placed Jonah's hand on the gentle swell of her belly and watched his whole world tilt as he whispered, "Our baby," like a prayer he'd never expected to have answered. When their son Henry was born and the valley came to celebrate with lanterns and laughter, Clara realized that every closed door, every broken promise, every empty platform she'd ever stood on had led her here, to this noisy, imperfect, fiercely chosen life. On quiet evenings, when the boy finally fell asleep against her shoulder and the two of them sat on the hill above their land, Jonah still sometimes asked if she ever wished Kerr had shown up on time that day. She would laugh, lean her head against his shoulder, and tell him the truth, that the man who never came had once felt like her last chance, but turned out to be nothing more than a sign pointing her toward the wrong life. The real miracle was the stranger who stepped forward instead, the one who offered a warm room, a stubborn kind of respect, and a place at his table long before he ever asked for her heart. Because sometimes the biggest mistake you think you've made, the wrong ticket, the wrong town, the wrong man on the platform, is just the road bending toward the love that was waiting all along, out past the last street lamp, under a sky big enough to hold every second chance. And if you want to hear more stories like Clara and Jonah's, about wrong turns that lead to the right forever, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us out here on the edge of the frontier, where the wind might take everything from you, just before it brings you home.